The New Orleans Saints just made a quiet $14 million decision, but it could define their entire defense. Because while most fans barely noticed, this move involving Bryan Bresee reveals something much bigger happening behind the scenes, and it's not as safe as it looks. But what this really means might surprise everyone. Everyone saw the headline, "The New Orleans Saints picked up Bryan Bresee's fifth-year option." Simple move, right? Just locking in a young defensive tackle with upside. But what if this wasn't just a routine decision? What if it was actually a gamble hiding in plain sight? Because when you really look at Bresee's career so far, the story isn't as clear as the Saints are making it seem. On paper, the flashes are there: interior pressure, athleticism, big moments. There was even a point where it felt like he was on the verge of a true breakout, the kind of leap that turns a promising player into a cornerstone. But then, things didn't fully take off the way many expected. One season, the pass rush looks dominant. The next, it cools off. Then suddenly his run defense improves, but the splash plays disappear. It's been this constant cycle of almost elite, almost consistent, almost worth building around. And that's where things get interesting. Because the Saints didn't wait for certainty. They didn't wait for that undeniable breakout season. Instead, they made a $14 million commitment based on projection, based on belief, based on what Bresee could become, not what he's proven to be. And in today's NFL, that kind of bet can either look genius or backfire fast. So now the pressure shifts. This isn't about potential anymore. This isn't about flashes. This is about whether Bryan Bresee can finally put everything together and become the player the Saints clearly think he is. Because if he does, this move changes everything for New Orleans. But if he doesn't, it raises a completely different question about the direction of this defense. And that's exactly where the real story begins. Why did the New Orleans Saints actually say yes to this move? Because on the surface it looks simple, but underneath there's a much deeper strategy unfolding. With Bryan Bresee, the Saints aren't just paying for production, they're betting on projection. They're looking at traits you can't teach: explosiveness off the snap, interior pass rush ability, the kind of athleticism that can completely disrupt an offense when everything clicks. And in today's NFL, pressure up the middle isn't just valuable, it's essential. Quarterbacks are faster than ever, smarter, getting the ball out in seconds. Edge pressure alone isn't enough anymore. You need someone who can collapse the pocket instantly, and Bresee has already shown flashes of being that guy. But it's not just about what he does on passing downs. What likely stood out to the Saints was his growth. The areas that used to be weaknesses, like run defense and consistency, started showing signs of real improvement. Not perfect, not elite, but trending in the right direction. And for a player still this young, that trajectory matters more than anything. Then there's the versatility. Bresee isn't just lining up and rushing the passer. He's impacting special teams, blocking kicks, making hustle plays that don't always show up in the stat sheet. Those moments build trust inside an organization. Coaches notice that. And timing played a role too. The Saints made this decision before the 2026 breakout could even happen, meaning they're trying to get ahead of the curve. If Bresee explodes next season, his price skyrockets. This way, they control the cost and the timeline. It's a calculated bet, one based on upside, development, and belief in their system to unlock him fully. But betting on potential instead of proven dominance always comes with risk. And if that belief doesn't pay off, this decision could look very different a year from now. Everything just changed for Bryan Bresee, and it has nothing to do with what he's already done. It's about what he's now expected to become. Because the moment the New Orleans Saints picked up that fifth-year option, this stopped being a development story and turned into a pressure situation. That $14 million number, it's not just a contract figure, it's a statement. It says the Saints don't see Bresee as a rotational piece anymore. They don't see him as a still-figuring-it-out player. They see him as someone who should be impacting games consistently, someone who should be disrupting quarterbacks every single week, someone offenses have to game plan around. And that's a completely different level of expectation. Because now, he's no longer being compared to young defensive tackles trying to find their footing. Now he's being measured against the players getting paid at the top of the position. The ones who don't just flash, they dominate. the ones who don't disappear for stretches, they take over games. And that's where things get complicated. Bresee has shown he can rush the passer. He's shown he can improve against the run, but doing both at a high level week after week, that's what separates good players from elite ones. That's what justifies this kind of investment. The margin for inconsistency is gone. No more he's still developing conversations, no more waiting for potential to show up. This is about production now, real impact, real results, and if those don't come quickly, the narrative around him could shift just as fast as the expectations did. Because in the NFL, once the money changes, so does the patience. And if he doesn't meet those expectations early, the pressure might hit harder than anyone expected. There's a bigger issue here that this move doesn't fix, and it's something the New Orleans Saints can't ignore anymore. Because even with Bryan Bresee locked in, this defensive line still feels incomplete. On paper, it looks solid. There are recognizable names, there's talent, there are flashes of disruption. But when you really break it down, something is missing, and it shows up in the moments that matter most. Consistent pressure. Yes, Bresee can collapse the pocket from the inside. Yes, there are players who can win their matchups occasionally. But the Saints don't have that one dominant force offense's fear before the snap. The kind of player who changes protection schemes. The kind of player who forces quarterbacks to speed up everything they do. And that's a problem. Take Chase Young, for example. The talent is obvious. The potential is still there, but his career so far has been defined more by inconsistency than dominance. He hasn't fully become that game-wrecking presence teams hoped for when he entered the league, and relying on what could be instead of what is a risky strategy. That leaves the Saints in a strange position. They have pieces but not a complete unit. They have upside but not certainty, and in today's NFL, that's not enough. The best defenses don't just have one or two contributors, they come in waves. Pressure from the edge, pressure up the middle, relentless, constant disruption. Right now, the Saints don't consistently bring that. Which means even with Bresee developing, even with internal growth, this unit still needs help. It still needs another difference maker. Another player who can tilt the field and take pressure off everyone else. Because without that, opposing offenses can adapt. They can adjust protections, they can neutralize what the Saints do best. And suddenly, that solid, defensive line doesn't feel so threatening anymore. And that's exactly why this problem might not be solved, it might just be getting started. The timing of this move by the New Orleans Saints isn't random, and that's where things start to get really interesting. Because with Bryan Bresee now locked in through 2027, the Saints just gave themselves something incredibly valuable heading into the 2026 NFL Draft: flexibility. At first glance, you might think this means they're done addressing the interior defensive line. Problem solved, right? But in reality, it might signal the exact opposite. Because locking in Bresee doesn't eliminate the need, it reshapes it. Now, instead of drafting out of desperation, the Saints can draft strategically. They're no longer forced to reach for a defensive tackle early. They can target the best player available. Or better yet, they can double down on the defensive line and build something much deeper. And that's where the twist comes in. There's a growing belief that the Saints could aggressively target versatile defensive linemen in this draft, players who can line up both inside and on the edge. Guys who don't just fill a role, but create matchup problems across the entire front. That kind of versatility is becoming a priority in today's NFL, and New Orleans might be positioning themselves ahead of that curve. Some fans believe this could even lead to the Saints drafting multiple defensive linemen. One early, one later, building waves instead of relying on one or two players to carry the load. And if that happens, it sends a very clear message. It means the Saints aren't fully satisfied yet. It means they're not just building around Bresee, they're insulating themselves in case he doesn't take that next step, creating competition, creating depth, creating options. Because the reality is, even with his potential, Bresee alone isn't enough to transform this unit into something elite. So this draft becomes bigger than just adding talent, it becomes about defining identity. Are the Saints building a dominant front or just patching holes? And depending on what they do next, we might finally get that answer. Coming out of college, Bryan Bresee wasn't just seen as good, he was viewed as special. A former top recruit with elite traits, dominant flashes at Clemson, and the kind of physical profile that had scouts talking about Pro Bowl potential before he even stepped onto an NFL field. The expectations were never low, they were sky high. And that's where the debate begins. Because since entering the league with the New Orleans Saints, Bresee hasn't been bad, not even close. He's been productive. He's shown real flashes. There have been moments where he looks exactly like that dominant interior force people projected him to be. But those moments haven't been consistent. One game, he's disrupting everything, collapsing pockets, forcing bad throws, making his presence felt. The next, he's quieter, still contributing but not taking over. And that inconsistency has quietly become the biggest question mark surrounding his career so far. So now fans are split. Some believe he's right on the edge of a breakout, that all the pieces are there and it's only a matter of time before everything clicks. The talent, the athleticism, the flashes, they see a future star ready to emerge. Others aren't so sure. Some fans believe the hype coming out of college set expectations too high, that while Bresee is a good player, he might not become that elite, game-changing defensive tackle people once imagined. Not a bust, but not a superstar either. And that tension, it's only growing louder. Because now, with the fifth-year option picked up, this debate isn't just about potential anymore, it's about reality. The Saints have made their belief clear. They're betting that the ceiling version of Bresee is still coming. But until that version shows up consistently on the field, the questions won't go away. And heading into this next season, he might finally have to answer them. So what is this move really? A smart long-term decision or a risky bet that could backfire? Because when the New Orleans Saints picked up Bryan Bresee's fifth-year option, they didn't just make a roster move, they made a statement about the future of their defense. They're choosing belief over certainty, projection over proven dominance. And that's always where things get tricky. On one side, you can see the vision. Bresee has the tools, the flashes are real, the upside is undeniable. If everything clicks, if he becomes more consistent, more complete, more disruptive, this deal could look like a steal. A foundational piece locked in before his true breakout. The kind of move smart teams make before everyone else catches on. But there's another side to this. Because the NFL doesn't reward potential, it rewards production. And right now, Bresee is still somewhere in between, not a question mark, but not a sure thing either. He hasn't fully crossed that line into being a player offenses fear every single week. And when you're committing this kind of money, that's exactly what you're expecting in return. That's why this decision feels so important. It's not just about one player, it's about direction. It's about whether the Saints are building something sustainable or simply hopping internal growth fills the gaps. Because if Bresee takes that next step, this defensive line suddenly looks a lot more dangerous, a lot more complete. But if he doesn't, the Saints could find themselves asking the same questions all over again. And in a league where timing is everything, getting that call wrong can set you back fast. So for now, the move sits right in the middle, full of upside but carrying real risk. And very soon, we're going to find out which side this decision falls on.